Hello and welcome to another video in Foundations in Maternal and Newborn Health. In today's video, we're going to continue on with the endocrinology unit, and we're going to cover the pancreas. So the pancreas is a gland like all the other endocrine organs. And so again, of course, glands make hormones. And the pancreas sits in the abdomen. So this is a diagram here of an abdomen. And it's as if you were looking at a patient. So this would be the patient's right here, and this would be the patient's left. And so in the right upper quadrant of the abdomen, of the patient's abdomen, this is the liver here in red. And so you can see the liver is quite large and it covers the other organs. So underneath organs are in dotted lines. And so in white here, this is the stomach. So your food would come down from up here. And then once the food passes through the stomach, this is the large and the small intestines. And then in yellow here, this here is the pancreas. So the pancreas makes a few different hormones, but the two that we'll focus on today is insulin and glucagon. So it'll be important to remember these two hormones. And I think the best way to describe what insulin and glucagon do is to kind of go through an example of what happens in your body after you've eaten some food. So let's imagine that you've eaten some food, and let's imagine it's something sugary. So let's imagine it's, maybe some candy or something. And after you've eaten that food, it'll travel down your esophagus, through your stomach, and then it'll travel into your small intestine. So this is the food kind of passing through you in blue. And the sugar from the food will actually be absorbed from your small intestine into your blood. And specifically, it's the sugar here. So this is the sugar from the food that's traveling into your blood. So this is sugar into blood. And when we talk about sugar, when we say sugar, sugar and glucose can be used interchangeably. So these, for our purposes, these mean the same thing. And so once sugar has made it into your blood, or glucose has made it into your blood, this blood actually travels up through your pancreas. So once the sugar's been absorbed, it travels up into your pancreas. And so your pancreas actually acts as a sensor. And so it notices when there's an increase in blood glucose. So the pancreas gets a bit of an alarm. So it acts as an alarm. So it notices that the sugar is in your blood, that there's an increase of sugar in the blood. And so it releases insulin into the blood. Okay, so what does insulin do? So if we imagine we have a blood vessel here. So this is a blood vessel. So these are the walls of the blood vessel here. And floating around in your blood is this new increase in blood sugar or blood glucose floating around in the blood. So in blue, this is glucose. And on the walls of these blood vessels, and in fact most cells of the body, you have these little receptors. And again, we talked about receptors in other videos, but receptors are sort of like mailboxes, and they pick up signals from elsewhere in the body. And these receptors are specifically insulin receptors. Insulin receptors. So they recognize insulin. And so when this glucose in the blood passes by your pancreas, it releases insulin. So we'll draw insulin as these little yellow dots here. This is insulin. And so these molecules of insulin will actually bind to these insulin receptors that are found throughout your body. And once insulin is bound to these receptors, your blood vessels and the cells within your tissues of your body, they will allow glucose to pass through them. So now glucose is allowed to come in through the walls of your blood vessels into your tissues. And so you can imagine that allowing the glucose out of your blood vessels and into the tissues, this will actually take blood glucose out of your blood. So the glucose is actually transported out of the blood into your tissues. And so what actually happens is that when insulin is released into the blood, blood glucose drops, it decreases. So insulin leads to a reduction or decrease in blood glucose. Decrease in blood glucose. But sometimes your tissues, even though insulin has told your tissues to absorb all of this glucose, your tissues don't always need all of this extra glucose, and so insulin also leads to your tissues storing more glucose. So this is stored. Increase in stored glucose. Okay, so we'll come back to why that's important, but for now it's just important to know that insulin leads to this reduction in blood glucose. Okay, so let's say you've eaten breakfast, maybe early in the morning, and your pancreas releases insulin to keep your blood glucose from getting too high after your morning breakfast. But after some time, you start to feel really hungry and your blood glucose is actually getting too low. So we'll say that over time, your blood glucose gets too low. So this drops very low. So blood glucose too low, we'll say. And so what happens when your blood glucose gets too low, and again, we talked about how the pancreas acts as a sensor. So it knows when you have too high or too low levels of glucose in the blood. So again, the pancreas is activated, but this time it recognizes that the blood has too little glucose rather than too much glucose. And so it releases glucagon instead. Glucagon instead of insulin. And so what glucagon does is it actually sends this glucose back into the blood. And so any glucose that was stored, so any extra glucose you have, will actually go back into the blood, and your blood glucose will increase again. So glucagon leads to your blood sugar increasing again. And if there's too much glucagon, your pancreas will actually notice that there's too much blood sugar, and it'll release more insulin. And so this comes back to this topic that we talked about in the introduction to endocrinology video, which is homeostasis. Homeostasis. And again, homeostasis is this healthy state that your body tries to maintain. And so your body tries to maintain a healthy level of blood glucose where it's not too high and not too low, and the pancreas helps achieve this by releasing insulin when the blood sugar is too high to bring blood sugar down, or when the blood sugar is too low to release glucagon to bring the blood sugar back up again. So this healthy cycle here, this homeostasis of blood glucose, is what happens in a healthy individual. And in the next video, we'll talk about diabetes and what goes wrong and what leads to problems with this homeostasis of blood glucose.